Welcome to Glisso English. Real life stories.
Have you ever given up your own dreams to build someone else's? For some, love isn't just a feeling, it's a decade-long investment. But what happens when that investment finally pays off? For everyone except you. Today on Glisso, we're diving into a story of sunk cost and survival. We're going to follow Elias, a man who worked a job he hated for 10 years to fund his partner's success, only to be left behind at the finish line. As we move through these 10 chapters, pay close attention to the vocabulary of sacrifice, corporate burnout, and emotional betrayal. We aren't just learning English today, we're learning how to rebuild an identity from scratch when the person you trusted most walks away. Let's begin. The rain in Seattle didn't feel romantic. It felt like a leak in the roof of their lives. Elias and Sarah sat in a booth at a diner where the vinyl seats were held together by duct tape. Between them lay a stack of medical school brochures and a vintage Leica camera that Elias had spent 3 years saving for. "I got into Johns Hopkins," Sarah whispered, her voice a mix of exhilaration and terror. "But Elias, the tuition, the housing, it's a mountain we can't climb." Elias looked at his camera, then at Sarah's hands that were meant to heal, to perform surgery, to change the world. His own dreams of being a photojournalist suddenly felt like a luxury they couldn't afford. In that moment, he made a unilateral decision. "I'll take the job," Elias said firmly, "the one at Global Logistics. They offered me a sales executive position last week. It's high commission, stable, and it's enough to cover everything." Sarah reached across the table, her eyes filling with tears. "But Elias, you hate sales. You said corporate culture feels like a fluorescent tomb. You're a storyteller. You're meant to be behind a lens, not a desk." Elias forced a smile, tucking his camera into its bag for what he didn't realize would be the last time in a decade. "It's not forever, Sarah. It's a pact. I'll be the foundation while you build the skyscraper. Once you're a surgeon, I'll quit and you can support me while I travel the world for my portfolio. 10 years. We can do 10 years, right?" They shook hands, a playful gesture to mask the gravity of the commitment. It was a contract signed in cheap coffee and youthful idealism. They called it the Great Swap. To Elias, it felt like a noble sacrifice, a temporary detour on the road to a shared future. He didn't see the fine print. The 10 years of suppressed identity doesn't just pause a life, it erodes it. As they walked out into the rain, Sarah was already talking about anatomy and residency. Elias was already practicing his corporate voice, ironing out the passion in his tone to make room for the pragmatism of his new reality. The sacrifice had begun. The air in the global logistics headquarters didn't circulate. It merely vibrated with the hum of 1,000 servers. By the second year of the pact, Elias had stopped checking the weather. It didn't matter if it was sunny or hailing. Inside the Fluorescent Tomb, the lighting was a constant, aggressive, medicinal white. Elias sat at a mahogany veneered desk that felt more like a barricade than a workstation. His job was mundane yet high stakes, cold calling regional distributors to sell shipping software they didn't know they needed. Every no was a dent in his soul. Every yes was a deposit into Sarah's tuition fund. "Elias, your numbers are plateauing," his manager, a man named Henderson, who wore irony-free power ties, barked from his glass office. "You've got the charisma, but you lack the tenacity. You need to close the deal, not interview the client." Elias nodded, his fingers twitching instinctively, as if searching for the shutter button of a camera that wasn't there. He had replaced his artistic eye with an analytical one. He didn't look at the way the light hit the coffee machine. He looked at the profit margins on the quarterly reports. To survive, he had to become a stranger to his own nature. At night, he would return to their cramped apartment, his mind a gray fog of logistics and shipping codes. Sarah would be buried under a mountain of anatomy textbooks, her highlighters creating a neon math of a world he no longer inhabited. "How was the tomb today?" she'd ask, barely looking up. "Productive," he'd lie, the word tasting like ash. "I secured the Midwest account. That's another semester covered." He never told her about the panic attacks in the stairwell or the way his hands shook when he opened his spreadsheet software. He didn't want to burden her sacred pursuit with his drudgery. He was the silent engine tucked away in the dark, while Sarah was the brilliant headlight cutting through the fog of their future. In his top desk drawer, hidden beneath a stack of invoices, Elias kept a single 35mm film canister. He never opened it. It was a relic of a past life, a ghost haunting the cubicle where his creativity had come to die.
By the 5th year, the Pact of Two had become a rhythm of ghosts. The tiny apartment with the duct-taped chairs was gone, replaced by a sleek, modern condo closer to the hospital. It was a physical manifestation of their upward mobility, yet Elias felt more like a guest in his own home than a resident. While Sarah's life was punctuated by milestones, her first successful solo surgery, her induction into the Surgical Honors Society, Elias's life was a blur of spreadsheets and red-eye flights to logistics hubs in the Midwest. His successes were invisible, measured only by the steady disappearance of their student debt. "We did it, Elias!" Sarah exclaimed one Tuesday evening, waving a bank statement like a trophy. "The undergraduate loans are officially zeroed out. We're finally breathing air that isn't borrowed." Elias looked at the paper. It represented 5 years of his life, roughly 12,000 hours of sales calls, 400 missed dinners, and a soul that felt increasingly hollowed out. "That's great, Sarah," he said, his voice reaching for an enthusiasm he couldn't quite grasp. "One more mountain to go, the residency debt." The disconnect between them was no longer just about their schedules. It was about their trajectories. Sarah was becoming a somebody. She spent her days in high-stakes environments where her decisions saved lives. Elias spent his days in a cubicle where his decisions merely moved boxes from point A to point B. When they attended hospital galas, Elias felt like a decorative attachment. "And what do you do, Elias?" a senior neurosurgeon asked him at a charity fundraiser, swirling a glass of expensive scotch. "I'm in logistics," Elias replied, the word feeling heavy and clumsy. "Ah, the backbone of the economy," the surgeon said with a polite, dismissive nod, before turning back to Sarah to discuss a complex cardiovascular procedure. Elias stood in the corner of the ballroom, surrounded by the elite of the medical world. He realized that while he had been the engine of Sarah's success, he had failed to maintain his own. He was the silent partner in a firm that didn't know his name. That night, for the first time, he didn't reach for his camera bag when he got home. The dust on the leather had become too thick to wipe away.
By year 7, the silence in the car on the way to the hospital was no longer peaceful. It was heavy. Elias had been promoted to Senior Director of Accounts, a title that sounded impressive but felt like a life sentence. His vocabulary had shifted entirely. He no longer talked about composition or lighting. He talked about deliverables, synergy, and leveraging assets. "I have a double shift today," Sarah said, checking her reflection in the visor mirror. She looked radiant, exhausted, yes, but lit from within by the fire of her own competence. "The chief of surgery is observing my aortic repair. It's a huge opportunity." "Good luck," Elias replied. "I have a negotiation with the Overseas Shipping Union. If we don't reach an agreement by Friday, the supply chain stalls." They were speaking two different versions of success. Sarah's language was clinical and vital. Elias's was administrative and dry. He had become an expert at corporate English, the art of saying a lot while feeling absolutely nothing. He used it to mask his burnout from his colleagues and his resentment from his wife. The real-life problem of Chapter 4 was the slow erosion of their common ground. At dinner, when they actually had it, Sarah would recount the adrenaline of the operating room. Elias would try to explain the complexity of a freight contract, but her eyes would glaze over. To her, his job was just a utility, like the electricity that powered the house. It was necessary, but uninteresting. One evening, Elias found an old notebook from their college days. In it, he had written a list of countries he wanted to photograph. He looked at the word Iceland and realized he couldn't remember why he had wanted to go. The passion had been suppressed for so long that it had gone dormant. He realized with a jolt of fear that he wasn't just working a job he hated, he was becoming a person he didn't recognize. He was the man who negotiated shipping rates, not the man who captured the soul of a city through a lens. He was a master of a language he never wanted to speak.
Year 8 felt like a marathon where the finish line kept receding. Elias stood in Henderson's glass office, the city skyline sprawling behind them. The Fluorescent Tomb had expanded into a corner suite, but the air felt just as thin. "Elias, you're the most reliable closer we've ever had," Henderson said, sliding a folder across the desk. "This is a 5-year contract for the VP of Global Operations. The salary is astronomical. The stock options alone would set you up for life." Elias looked at the document. It was the year of the Brink. This promotion was the final lock on the door of his creative life. If he signed this, he wasn't just supporting Sarah through her final fellowship, he was committing to a career path he had promised himself was only temporary. "I need to discuss this with my wife," Elias said, his voice flat. That night, the luxury condo felt cold. Sarah was celebrating a successful bypass surgery, her energy high. When Elias showed her the contract, she didn't see a prison sentence. She saw validation. "Elias, this is incredible," she said, pouring a glass of wine. "Think of the security. We could finally buy that house in the hills. We could stop worrying about the what-ifs." "But Sarah," Elias countered softly, "the pact was for 10 years. I'm at year 8. I'm tired. I thought once you finished your fellowship, I could finally go back to my photography." Sarah paused, the glass halfway to her lips. The silence was palpable. "Of course you can, eventually. But to walk away from a VP position now? It seems impractical. We're finally winning, Elias. Don't you want to see how far we can go?" Elias realized then that their definitions of winning had fundamentally diverged. For Sarah, winning was an ascent. For Elias, winning was an escape. He felt a sharp pang of resentment, a bitter taste that he quickly swallowed. He looked at the woman he loved, the woman whose dream he had carried on his back for nearly a decade, and he signed the contract. He chose her dream over his own one last time, convinced that this final sacrifice would be the one that anchored their future forever. He was wrong. Year 10 arrived not with a bang, but with a gala. Sarah had been named a senior partner at her firm, a prestigious appointment that signaled she had officially reached the summit. The struggle was over. The late-night study sessions, the debt, and the uncertainty had been replaced by a life of luxury and social standing. The celebration was held at a rooftop lounge overlooking the city. Sarah was the star of the evening, moving through the crowd with a sophisticated grace that made it look like she had been born for this life. Elias stood beside her, his tailored suit hiding a body that felt permanently stiff from a decade of office chairs. "We finally made it," Sarah whispered to him during a quiet moment between toasts. "The mountain is behind us." Elias looked at her, searching for the girl from the duct-taped diner. She was still beautiful, but her eyes held a new kind of steel, a clinical detachment that came from years of making life-and-death decisions. He realized he was waiting for her to say the next part of the pact. "Now it's your turn." But the words didn't come. Instead, the conversation around the table turned to Phase 2, high-end real estate, charity boards, and international medical conferences. Elias's sacrifice was treated as a foregone conclusion, a historical footnote that everyone, including Sarah, seemed to have already archived. "Elias has been my rock," Sarah told the group, her hand resting briefly on his arm. "I literally couldn't have survived residency without his unwavering support." The guests nodded politely, acknowledging him as a successful support staff member. No one asked about his photography. No one asked what he had given up. To this elite circle, Elias wasn't an artist on a detour. He was a corporate executive who happened to be married to a brilliant surgeon. As the night ended, Elias looked out at the city lights. He had reached the summit, but he realized he was standing on the wrong mountain. He had spent 10 years building a world he didn't want to live in, and for the first time he felt a chilling premonition. The person he had become was no longer compatible with the woman he had built this world for.
The shift was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, silent erosion. Now that the pressure of survival was gone, the silence between Elias and Sarah changed. It was no longer the comfortable silence of two tired people resting. It was the hollow silence of two people with nothing left to say. Sarah's world had expanded. She was frequently invited to weekend symposiums and networking retreats in the Hamptons or Aspen. Initially, she insisted Elias come along, but the friction was evident. While Sarah discussed the latest innovations in robotic surgery, Elias sat quietly, unable to contribute to the high-level medical shop talk. He was a VP of logistics, but in this room, he felt like a high-functioning ghost. "You seem distant this weekend," Sarah said on the drive home from a coastal retreat. Her tone wasn't accusatory. It was worse. It was apathetic. "I don't belong in those rooms, Sarah," Elias said, looking out the window at the passing trees. "I spent 10 years making sure you belonged in them. I never had the time to build a seat for myself." Sarah sighed, a sharp, clinical sound. "Elias, don't make this about the past. We're in a new phase now. I need a partner who can keep up, someone who shares this lifestyle." The word lifestyle hit Elias like a physical blow. He realized that Sarah didn't see their life as a shared journey anymore. She saw it as a status she had earned. To her, Elias was a reminder of the scarcity years, the years of debt, duct tape, and struggle. Every time she looked at him, she saw the man who had worked the job he hated, and that memory seemed to weigh her down. The drift became physical. Sarah started staying late at the hospital, not because she had to, but because she felt more at home there. Elias started taking long walks at night, carrying his old Leica. He didn't take any pictures, he just felt the weight of the metal in his hand, wondering if he still knew how to see the world through a lens, or if the tomb had finally blinded him for good.
The end didn't happen in a heated argument. It happened over a glass of expensive mineral water in their granite-topped kitchen. Sarah was dressed for a flight to a conference in Geneva. Her luggage was already waiting by the door, sleek, expensive, and professional. "Elias, we need to be honest with each other," she began. Her voice had the same steady, impersonal tone she used when delivering a difficult diagnosis to a patient's family. "I've been thinking about the last 10 years. I am so grateful for everything you did. Truly, I wouldn't be here without you." Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. In English, when someone leads with, "I'm grateful," a "but" is almost always lurking in the shadows. "But," she continued, confirming his fear, "we've become different people. When I look at you, I see the struggle. I see the pact. And I realize that I've been staying out of obligation, not because we are still a match. We are tethered by a debt that has already been paid." "A match?" Elias asked, his voice cracking. "Sarah, I gave you my 30s. I worked a job that made me miserable so you could have this life. I didn't stay out of obligation. I stayed because I loved you." Sarah looked away, her gaze landing on her designer watch. "And I appreciate that sacrifice, but love shouldn't feel like a repayment plan. You deserve to find yourself again, Elias, and I need to move forward without feeling the weight of what you gave up for me." The cruelty of her logic was breathtaking. She was framing the breakup as a gift to him, a chance for him to find himself, while simultaneously shedding the only person who knew the cost of her success. She was divesting herself of the witness to her humble beginnings. By the time the Uber honked outside, the conversation was over. There was no room for negotiation, no sales pitch that could close this deal. Sarah walked out the door, leaving Elias standing in a luxury condo he had bought with 10 years of his life, surrounded by expensive things that suddenly felt like hollow plastic. The Sever was complete.
The day after Sarah left, Elias did something he hadn't done in 3,650 days. He didn't set an alarm. He woke up to a silence so profound it felt heavy. The luxury condo, once a symbol of their shared victory, now felt like a sanctuary of ghosts. He walked into his home office, a room dedicated to logistics and global shipping, and sat at his desk. He looked at the VP contract he had signed 2 years prior. With a strange, calm detachment, he opened his laptop and typed a 2-sentence resignation letter. There was no grand speech, no dramatic exit. He simply walked away from the tomb. The real-life problem of Chapter 9 was the sudden loss of gravity. For a decade, Elias's identity had been defined by the sacrifice. He was the provider. He was the supporter. Without Sarah to support and without a job to hate, he was a void. He spent the first week wandering the city with his old Leica. He tried to take photos, but he found he didn't know what to look at. His eyes had been trained to see data, not light. He saw a sunset and thought of energy costs. He saw a crowd and thought of traffic flow. The corporate world had colonized his imagination. One afternoon, he stopped at a park bench and looked at his reflection in a shop window. He saw a man in an expensive coat with tired eyes and a camera that looked like a prop from a movie he'd forgotten the plot of. "Who are you?" he whispered to the glass. The answer didn't come, but as he sat there, he noticed a young couple nearby. They were arguing over a stack of bills, their faces etched with the same starting line terror he and Sarah once had. For the first time in years, Elias felt a spark of a different emotion, not resentment, but clarity. He realized that while he couldn't get his 10 years back, he was the only person left who owned his future. He wasn't a VP, and he wasn't Sarah's husband. He was a man with a camera and a story that had cost him everything. It was time to see if that story was worth telling.
The final chapter of Elias's decade-long journey didn't take place in a boardroom or a hospital wing. It took place in a small, rented studio in a part of town where the rent was cheap and the light was honest. The luxury condo had been sold, the furniture liquidated, and the proceeds put into a modest savings account. Elias was no longer a VP of global operations. He was, once again, a photographer. But he wasn't the same idealistic boy from the diner. His new work was different. It was raw, heavy, and deeply human.
He began a project titled The Hidden Foundation, a series of portraits of people who worked behind the scenes to support the dreams of others. The night shift janitors, the long-haul truckers, and the spouses working dead-end jobs to pay for a partner's degree. One evening, he held his first solo exhibition. The gallery was small, filled with the scent of floor wax and cheap wine. As he stood among his photos, he realized he felt a sense of equilibrium he hadn't known in years. He wasn't waiting for a milestone or a thank you. He was simply present. A woman stopped in front of a photo of a weary man staring at a spreadsheet. "There's so much weight in his eyes," she remarked. "It's like he's carrying a whole world that isn't his." "He is," Elias replied quietly, "but he's learning how to set it down." The story of the unrequited sacrifice ends not with a reconciliation with Sarah, who was now a world-renowned surgeon, her life a blur of success and new faces, but with Elias's own reclamation. He hadn't wasted 10 years, he had survived them. He had learned the language of the world so that he could finally speak his own. As he walked home that night, he didn't feel the ghost of the Fluorescent Tomb following him. He looked at the city not as a grid of logistics, but as a sea of stories. He raised his camera, framed the moon between 2 jagged apartment buildings, and finally he clicked the shutter. The lens was new, but the vision was finally his own. The sacrifice was over. The life had begun. Elias didn't get his 10 years back, but he did get himself back. Sometimes the most important reclamation project in our lives is the one we perform on our own hearts. In today's story, we saw how the sunk cost fallacy can keep us trapped in situations that no longer serve us. Whether it's a job you hate or a relationship that has become a repayment plan, remember, you are allowed to walk away and start over, no matter how much time has passed. I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever made a sacrifice that went unrewarded? Or is there a word from today's story that perfectly describes a chapter in your own life? Let's discuss it below. It's a great way to practice your English and support the community. If this story resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe for more real-life problems solved through storytelling and English. I'll see you in the next story. Goodbye.